Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Linehammer exists, and I suppose the first thing I should do is to just tip my hat to Dr. Blackstill for coining the phrase Linehammer and for recognizing quite early on that it would be a thing. I think everybody saw that Dragonhammer was a thing, but weren't quite convinced that Linehammer would be a thing. But it does exist, and the purpose of this video isn't to rehash the debate about whether or not it should exist or whether it ought to be used in friendly games with an opponent, or indeed whether it says anything about the overall state of the old world rule set. We're going to save that debate for another day. What I do want to do, however, is go through some of the mechanics in the gameplay when you're using a Linehammer tactic. So, first of all, what is Linehammer? Now, most of the things I'm going to talk about in this video are just to do with wide units generally. Now, obviously, because the way that the rules are in the old world, first of all, your whole of your fighting rank can fight in close combat, right? And your second rank can't fight. So you're incentivized in order to get more attacks to use wide formations. And also your ability to fall back in good order, in other words, your ability to lose combat and not flee and lose your whole unit, is based on your unit strength and not on your rank bonus as it was in previous editions, right? So you're encouraged by many sections of the rules to go into wide formations and not deep formations, right? So Linehammer is simply taking advantage of that and going on a very wide unit with just one single rank, okay? And it works best, of course, with single attack infantry and cavalry, because obviously if you've got multiple attacks, you can only use those in base-to-base contact anyway. And so having single attack infantry kind of lends itself to a Linehammer strategy. And of course, missile troops, because then they can get lots of attacks in the shooting phase and in the close combat phase. Now, a lot of the weird interactions in a Linehammer formation will come when you're pivoting, okay? So I thought it'd be helpful just to put this up on the screen to begin with before we get into some diagrams. Now, it says pivoting. Sometimes the rules will require a unit to pivot, usually about its center. This is exactly as it sounds. The unit is not performing any of the maneuvers previously described, so obviously this is within the maneuvers section of the movement phase. Instead, it spins on the spot, using its center as a pivot point, ignoring the presence of other units or terrain whilst it does so. So you pivot for various different reasons during the game. Normally in the close combat phase, it'll be when you win combat and you pivot in order to pursue an enemy that is falling back or fleeing, or you lose combat and you pivot in order to flee, right? And there are other situations which you'll pivot as well, but it does say ignoring units and terrain, so you can pivot through other things. However, because you're in such a big line, when you pursue or flee or you're pivoting in your movement phase, then you're quite often going to come into contact with other units or terrain or indeed the board edge, as we'll come to in a minute. So just thought I'd get the pivoting rules out of the way. So number one, the quick turn. So here's our line of dwarf rangers, which you might commonly see using a Linehammer formation. Now, if you're in an open order formation in the game, you can pivot after your movement about your center to change your facing by up to 90 degrees. Now, if you're in a line, you're not actually going to get to 90 degrees when you pivot, because each model in the unit can't move more than double their movement within a maneuver, okay? So unless we've charged, marched, or fled, right? So it's just a normal move. So our dwarf rangers might do a normal move and then pivot. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, it might be that obviously they want to shoot in the shooting phase. Now, the problem with a line is that your arc of sight, right, is only at sort of 45-degree angles like that. And so quite often when a unit's quite close to you, not all of your models are going to have an arc of sight. So only half of the rangers there will be able to see this goblin unit in the picture. And so you want to kind of maneuver around so that you can change, the direction that your unit's facing so that you can get more shots in the shooting phase. And being an open order formation allows you to do this a lot easier. Let's say they want to move forward first, which they can do. They can then pivot around the center, which will look something like that. Now, obviously, you're going to be measuring from either side of the unit to make sure that no model is going more than 6 inches. But as you can see, it kind of allows you a certain degree of maneuverability, because you can have some models going forward and some models going backwards, and your whole line will sort of spin a little bit after you've done a move. So you could move 3 inches forward or 1.5 inches back, and then do this kind of pivot and change the facing of your unit. And of course, yeah, so you can move through other units and terrain, right? So as you can see, the dwarfs on the left there have moved through that rock formation on the left side of the screen. You might even have another line. Let's say you're running two lines, and the lines might be able to move through the other line of troops if the two ends of the line are overlapping. Okay, so the flee. Now, one thing you've got to think about when running a line formation is to not get too near the board edge. And actually, if you've got a very long line, you need to be fairly near the middle of the board, because if you're pivoting around, if you lose combat and you pivot in order to flee, there's a big chance you're going to hit that board edge, right? So let's say we're running a line of orcs here. Here come the knights, and they charge into us. Now, because we measure center to center from flees, then, okay, let's take some casualties in the combat first. We could pick the centers of the unit like that. Now, what's going to happen when you're running a line is that quite often the center of your line will be a long way away from the enemy unit that's made contact with you, right? So it'll be far to the left or far to the right. Now, in this picture, you can see, let's say the orcs win combat, which of course the line does tend to win combat. Then the knights are going to be fleeing at quite an acute angle there, and they're likely to go towards the board edge. Now, you can use that in your favor, right? When adjusting the angle of your line, because you know that a charging unit has to go the most direct route possible into your line, then you can try and think about the angle, should you win combat, that that unit will flee, and try and direct it towards the board edge. The problem is, however, if your line has to flee, well then, look, it pivots around like that, and as soon as it touches the board edge, it's gone. And look, if your line pivots around and all of a sudden it's going in a vertically up the board, then the chances are you're going to go off the board pretty quick. The charge move. Okay, so because a line is so long, it can be as long as you want it to, of course, but if you're using a long line of rangers, I think we've got about 20, 22 rangers in the picture at the bottom there. You can pretty much only make a charge if the unit you're charging is directly in front of you. Now, in this diagram here, you can see our orc boys on the left there are not directly in front of the rangers. In other words, the ranger unit needs to wheel a little bit in order to make sure it's facing directly in front of that orc unit so that it can clip on the corner, right? So it's going to have to wheel a little bit. For the ranger on the left, it's only a small wheel to get facing that orc boy, but because the line is so long, the wheel, of course, is measured by the outside edge. So now you can see that that charge, which was perfectly makeable before, is now more than double what it was, because you've got to measure the wheel on the outside, on the right here, and obviously the actual charge distance on the left. And so you're only pretty much, if you've got to wheel a little bit, then the charge becomes unmakeable because you're measuring from the outside edge. So you're only going to make a charge when the unit's right in front of you. But what will often happen, especially if you've got a line of, say, rangers and you've got missile weapons, is that the enemy is going to want to come quite close to you before they declare a charge on you, right? Because if they declare a charge from quite far away and you're got to stand and shoot, the chances are, well, they fail the charge and then they're giving you more chances to shoot them, right? So what's going to happen is that they're going to want to come quite close to you. Aligning to the enemy. Okay, so here's our unit of orc boys that's come quite close. Now, again, the center of our unit is far away from that orc boy unit. And actually, if they charge us, well, they're obviously charging us in the front. But if we charge them, we're actually in the flank. Now, typically with the rangers, you're going to think, well, why don't we just stick there and we can shoot them and then we can stand and shoot them again. And perhaps we've got throwing axes or something. But actually, what's going to happen is you're going to manufacture flanks quite often when you're running a line, and it will happen even if you don't even realize it happens. Just because your line's so long, you'll declare a charge and you'll realize, oh, hang on a minute, I'm in your flank, aren't I? Because the majority of my models are actually facing the flank of those orc boys. And you've got to think about this, because obviously you're going to, other units and things will get in the way, things that you don't even realize are in the way. Okay, so just to go through what the charge would look like first. So you'd come and you clip on the corner there, and you do like a big, almost 90-degree align to the enemy, right? Now, this is not something new to Old World. This existed in previous edition as well, right? It was called close the door. And if you're running a long line, you get a free close the door, right? So you might have a dwarf that's like traveling halfway across the board in order so that your unit can align to the flank of the unit that's being charged. Now, here we've got some rocks at the top in the center. Now, it looks to any outside observer that those dwarves charging those orcs are just going to charge them, and that rock is nowhere near the combat. How could that possibly get in the way? But if you're in the flank, look, it will, because you're going to swivel round and you can't align fully. You're going to make contact with that rock. Now, in the charging section, it says unusual situations, and it says unable to align. So reading from the bottom there where it says unable to align, on occasion, a charging unit will be able to make contact with its charged target, but unable to align to it because something lies in the way, in this case, a rock. In such cases, the charged target should align itself against the charging unit. Okay, so what's going to happen then is those orcs are going to change their facing and align to you. Now, things like that will happen quite a lot when you're running a long line because other things will just get in the way. You're so wide, other units or terrain are going to get in the way. So quite often you'll get a disordered charge. But obviously, these dwarf rangers are running great weapons, so they probably won't mind that much. Although still, with great weapons moving 3 inches, you go up to initiative 4, and perhaps they would want to get the jump on those orcs, but they're going to get a disorder charge, and so they're not going to get their charge bonus to initiative. Now, what about this situation? Now, this is a bit more complicated because our orcs are already in combat with our unit of Ironbreakers on the left here, so they can't align to us. And the thing that lies in the way is not a rock anymore, it's actually another enemy unit, a unit of goblins. So our rangers come in, they try to align to the enemy, and they can't. So now what do we do? Well, let's go back to our unusual situations. First of all, I think it's good to read the bit at the top because it says, should a situation ever arise that cannot easily be resolved, players should agree with one another upon the most logical course of action and avoid getting bogged down in overly long debates. And I think it's nice that they said that, right? Because there's an admission there that the game is complex, and when you've got multiple units fighting multiple other units, there's always going to be situations arising that aren't covered in the rulebook, that couldn't have possibly been play tested every single thing that could possibly arise. And so it's a gentleman's game, right? You've got to come up with a way that makes most sense within the rules, that is fair, and that there's no sort of overly bad feeling there that you're being gamed out of having a fair fight, right? So avoid getting bogged down in overly long debates. But look, I mean, it says unable to align because something lies in the way. It doesn't say what that something might be. It could be an enemy unit like this, and therefore it says if it's not possible for you to align or your enemy unit to align to you, then you simply leave a gap, which would mean that the dwarf rangers are in combat. They've made contact with the orc unit. They're just unable to align to it. So they are in combat with those orc boys, and therefore the new fighting rank that's been opened up for those 3 orcs there, they're now in red, are fighting the long line of rangers, and the goblins aren't in combat. We're just 1 inch away from the goblin unit. However, on a couple of pages later, it says multiple charge targets. Now, a unit may be unable to charge its intended target without making contact with other enemy units. Now, I think this is a bit unclear. When it says unable to charge its intended target, does that mean unable to make initial contact, or unable to make initial contact and align to the enemy? Now, I'm reading that as unable to make initial contact, because a little bit further in the next paragraph, it says if the charging unit is unable to align itself to all the enemy units, it kind of deals with the aligning bit separately. So I'm reading that as just if you're unable to make contact initially, but it is admittedly quite unclear, and perhaps we should be forced to charge those goblins as well if we realize that we're going to align in such a way that would bring other units into the fight, right? So perhaps we should swing over a bit more to make contact there, and then the goblins align with us, and then we're in contact with the goblins, and there's a gap here and we're fighting the orcs. Again, it's one of those situations where it's all a bit crazy. You could even, if your opponent agreed, perhaps get those orcs to align with the line and then move the Ironbreakers as well, so that it all kind of looks neat. But, these are situations which do happen very often, unfortunately, when you're running a line. Simply because it's so wide, you're going to end up bringing other units into the fray. There is a diagram around that part of the rulebook, which I thought I'd just mention briefly because it seems to address the issue. I don't think it quite addresses it fully. And this is where it says, well, you've got to charge, if A wants to charge C in the diagram here, so the orcs want to charge the rangers, they can't do that without making contact with those 2 units of longbeards there, because A is so wide, the corner of A is going to clip B and D as it makes contact with unit C, which I don't think is quite the issue here. I think most people would agree, look, if you've got to make contact with B and D in order to make initial contact with C, yeah, okay, you've got to declare a charge against all three units. I think what would be more helpful is to look at it like this. So let's say our Orc boys want to charge into the Iron Breakers on the left there. So they'll move into contact straight forward. They'll make contact with the Iron Breakers. What happens now? Do the Iron Breakers align to the Orcs, like so? In which case, you'll fight that round of combat and possibly bring the Rangers in later if the Orcs win combat and overrun. Or would it be that the Orcs come in, make contact with the Ironbreakers, and then try to align and then clip the Rangers as they're aligning, and then there's a multi-combat happening? So personally, I think it's the former, but let me know in the comment section below how you play it and what your reasoning is as to what would make most sense. I think this situation here kind of makes most sense narratively, because those Orcs are coming in a long line. They're so close to those Rangers. It kind of makes sense that they'd have to charge them as well. But then again, I think the rules, as the way they're written, state that actually you wouldn't be able to line and you'd stop an inch away from those Rangers. But let me know what you think in the comments. Close combat. Now, thing is with the line is that often you're going to have multiple units in combat with you in the front of your line or in the back of your line. And it does say that your models have to attack the nearest unit. They can't choose which unit they attack, okay, unless the units are equidistant from your model, and then it has a choice. And there are diagrams which show that that is the case. Now, let's say in our example here, we've got our Orc boys and the War Boss that make contact initially with our line of Rangers. Now, only the Rangers shaded in red at the bottom of the screen there would be able to attack the Orc boys. All of the Rangers in white would have to attack the War Boss, which means that that War Boss is kind of taking the full brunt of the line, and the Orc boys have a bit of a break, right? Because most of the line, they're being protected from most of the line by that Orc War Boss. Now, as the Orc player, maybe you want that. Maybe you want most of those attacks going into the Orc War Boss, although, I don't know, Rangers with great weapons, maybe they take down the War Boss, but I suppose it depends what saving throw he has. And I think this is quite odd, actually, because just consider if that War Boss was a little bit to the left and actually in the unit with the Orcs, now all of the Rangers would obviously be attacking the Orc boys. It's just because it's a separate unit and it's outside that the Rangers have to split their attacks and can't choose. So those Rangers on the right-hand side of the screen cannot attack the Orc boys. So let's say, we have a round of combat, we take some casualties, there's a give ground, and now all three units come in at once. So now we've got a totally different situation here, because in this situation, the Orc War Boss is only going to take a maximum of 3 attacks, because all of the dwarves shaded in blue will have to attack the goblins, all of the dwarves shaded in red will have to attack the Orcs. And so this allows a bit of, I suppose, tactics when facing Linehammer, in that you can choose which part of the line is going to attack your models based on where they make contact with the line. Now, I say you can choose. You don't get that much of a choice, because obviously when you charge, you have to charge directly into the line because of the rules on charging. You have to go to the most direct route. So you can't just be at one point and say, I'm going to charge the line at that point. You'd have to move over there first and then declare the charge. So you don't get that much choice, but if with some careful planning in the prior turns before you charge, you could get into a position where you're able to select how much of the line is going to swing into you. Okay, last one then, move through the ranks. Now, this is when you've got a character in the unit, which used to be called make way, and you're not in the fighting rank, you can move through the ranks into the fighting rank. Okay, so here's our Orc boys with our War Boss on the right-hand side there. Now, let's say we're silly enough to move up and open up a flank, okay, to the enemy. In come the Knights. Now here, look, the Knights have quite a favourable combat here now, because they've got 5 Knights in the fighting rank and we've only got 1 Orc in the fighting rank. Now, this, I suppose, is one of the big weaknesses of lines, in that you could get into a situation like that in which you're kind of almost certain to lose combat because you've only got 1 attack in that fight. Now, obviously, we could lose combat, fall back in good order, and then reform in a way so that the full line is to bear against those Knights. So all is not lost, if our unit strength is high enough. But initially, it looks like we're going to lose combat. However, because our war boss is not in the fighting rank, he can now teleport into the fighting rank all the way down the line in order to fight those knights. Now, because it's only a single rank, the rules on too many characters don't apply, because it says unless a unit contains only a single rank, its fighting rank cannot contain more characters than it does rank and file models. Now, again, I think the rules are a bit unclear here, right? Because do those knights now have to attack the war boss, or can they fight the orcs? There aren't any orcs in the fighting rank. It's just the war boss in the fighting rank. But can they attack through the war boss into the orcs? Now, it doesn't explicitly say it either way. It does say if you're in a multiple combat, you have to fight the units that you're in base of contact with. But because the war boss is in the orcs, they kind of count as one unit now instead of separate units. So I think it's a bit unclear. Perhaps a future FAQ will clear it up. But normally that won't happen, and you won't have this situation, right? Because of this too many characters rule. If there are too many characters in the fighting rank, some of them have to retire. So you've always got rank and file in the fighting rank. So this thing only comes when you're running a Linehammer formation and someone hits you in the flank, your character makes way, or your character is already there. And now, what? You have to attack the character because there's no rank and file in the fighting rank? I can't think of another reason why they would have this too many characters rule, but let me know how you guys are playing it at home. In this situation, would those knights be able to attack the orc boys, or would they be forced to swing into the war boss? In either way, even if they can attack the orc boys, I think moving your character into the flank there would be able to protect them and give them a good advantage in the fight. All right, guys, thanks for listening. Let me know what you think about Linehammer generally, and I'll catch you on the next one. Cheers, goodbye.